Hello, Rabbi Schwartz. Shavua Tov, Kodesh Tov, great to see you.
Hello, Rabbi James. How are you?
Baruch Hashem.
How you doing? What's new?
What's new? It's a new month.
Yeah, Baruch Hashem. Actually, it's
New...
still Tishrei, but it is
Oh,
Rosh
you
Chodesh.
rabbis are so technical.
My lawyer history is what does that.
The question is, in Tishrei, why isn't the first day of Rosh Hashanah the 30th day of Elul?
It is an excellent question. The answer to that is is that we effectively is that it is the 30th day of Elul, the first day of Rosh Hashanah. We consider it the first day of Tishrei, and so it would be, we imagine every year as a year in which we really should have only one day of Tishrei. The question is really, why isn't the second day of Rosh Hashanah the first day of Tishrei? I guess. Anyway.
Well, it's the same question, right?
Yeah, to some degree. Yeah. But we treated it like the first day.
If we only had one day there, would we only have one day here?
No,
we'd have to have 3 days now, right?
3 days.
No, because we'd be pushed back a day. No, it'd
Yeah.
be the opposite. We only need 29 days in Tishrei.
Yeah.
Hey, Shavua Tov, everyone. Chodesh Tov.
Kodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov.
Are we still learning Eruvin?
Yeah.
We're still learning Eruvin. Today's daf is daf Samach Tet, Set. And we are. I'm sorry?
Set was in this week's parsha.
That's true. Depending on how you pronounce it, right? It's just that this is a Samach. When we get to daf Shin, we'll be in a different place. So we are at 2 lines from the bottom of Samachet Amabed, I believe. That's what David said, Amar Mar, correct? So I will remind you of the Mishnah. I find this to be very confusing, but I can assure you it's not nearly as hard as the Dapim we did this week. So whoever did those, get credit to you. I was just grateful it wasn't me, I think.
They were tough. We went really slowly. I've used the full hour each day, so it was hard.
Incredibly tough. So this is not simple, but it's not nearly as hard. So basically our Mishnah, which is still the beginning Mishnah of this parak, I think, Hadar, talked about if a person lives in a courtyard, which is not uncommon, and there's a person living in that courtyard who doesn't participate in the Eruv. So the Mishnah's example was a non-Jew, a Goy. And the Mishnah clearly was of the opinion that a Goy cannot participate in an Eruv. And therefore, you cannot walk into the Chatzar on Shabbat because it's as if you have one person, well, even though he doesn't really own Rishut, but whatever, you can't do it. And the only way out of it is either being an individual, according to Reb Lezman Yaakov, or if you can rent space from the guy, which we talked about, you can even do it on Shabbos maybe, or if the guy is Mevatel Rishut, if the guy cancels the Rishut. So we said in the Mishnah that in general, there's a mechanism for that. There's a mechanism if a person does not participate in the Eruv, but they have a space in the Chatzar. So let me just clarify, sorry. Let's say you have 5 people who live in one courtyard. So in order for anyone to carry in that courtyard on Shabbat, all 5 have to join together to become one. Let's say 4 of them join together. They thought the 5th one was going to be away or whatever. And then he's there. So nobody can use that Chatzar because it's owned by people who didn't make an Eruv. They have a portion. If the Yisrael wants to, they can give up, they can relinquish, which is called bitul. They can relinquish their right to a portion of that courtyard, and then they cannot carry their own Shabbat, but everybody else can carry. Well, they might be able to carry if they're a guest. Sorry, we'll get into that today. But they're not an owner anymore. Everyone else can carry. A non-Jew cannot do bitul, right? So you cannot do that if it's a non-Jew. The Mishnah then continued yesterday. Well, we explained it yesterday.
For the Jew, is this a temporary state, or you have to do it every week, or it's a permanent?
You have to do it every week, and it is. I mean, it's temporary. Yeah, you can also go back. We had an argument yesterday as well, and days before, as to whether you can change it back in the middle of the day. Can you say I'm mevatel my reshut to B, and then B does it back to A? We'll get into some of that today.
Hmm.
But it presumably lasts for that Shabbat. I don't think it's every week. It's a good point. But yesterday we added that a tzedukis, so remember tzedukim are Jews who are not of the same belief system as the chachamim. They don't believe in Torah Shabbat Peh is I think the simplest way that the Gemara says it. But tzedukim are, the Mishnah said, tzeduki harehu kinachri. A tzeduki is like a non-Jew, and therefore a tzeduki who lives in the courtyard also cannot be mevatel their reshut to allow the other Jews living there to carry on Shabbat. Make big problems. And Rabbi Gamliel said, Tzduki is not like a Nachri, and a Tzduki can be Mevatel, and there was a story in my house, and that's what we quoted yesterday. So now we're back on the 2 lines from the bottom. Amar Mar, Hotzi'u Masha Atem Motzi'im. This is a quote from the story that Rabbi Gamliel said or Rabbi Gamliel told his children apparently, that you should take out what you can take out, and bring in what you want to bring in. Before this, to'ev is a not kind word, and there'll be a slur nowadays, right? And this person, meaning this tzeduki, comes out and osters you. What's the case? The case is where, according to Rabbi Gamliel, a tzeduki is allowed to be mevatel. But the problem is that if the tzeduki says, I'm mevatel my right to this courtyard, to you, then you can carry. But if the tzeduki, it seems in the Mishnah to say, that if the tzeduki then walks out and carries something into the courtyard, that he's changing his mind, and he's taking back his right. So like James's question, it's not forever, and it's as long as I want it to be. And if the tzeduki shows that he's changing his mind, then you no longer can carry, right? The memra, what that means to imply, says the Gemara, is the chimapki inhu. If they go out, meaning if the tzeduki walked out into the courtyard, it would cancel his bitul. The Rabbi Gamliel is telling his children, or his father was telling him, if you go out first, then you'll take care of the problem. If you take stuff out first, then basically you used his bitul, and he can no longer uproot it, right? So what that implies is the chimapki inhu, that if they, meaning the Rabbi Gamliel's children, take stuff out, and then hadar mapik iyu, and then the tzeduki does it, lo asar. It doesn't cancel his bittul. But the Mishnah, which we're going to learn later today, says, this is what it says. Misha natan reshuto. If a person gives somebody else permission in their courtyard, let's just say it's tzeduki, but it could be anyone, but then after giving you permission, they then carry, hotzi, then that person carries out. Then says the Mishnah, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, oser. Whether you do it b'shogeg or b'mezid, it osers, right? Divrei Rabbi Meir. So that implies that even if you carry out first, there's no limitation on this, that once the person, in this case the tzeduki, but in the Mishnah, anyone, carries out, it will remove their permission for you to carry there. Amar Rav Yosef, no, you have to change the Mishnah. Ema ino oser. In fact, what our Mishnah should say is that Rabbi Meir holds it does not oser. That it doesn't matter if the person carries out as long as you already used it. Amar Abaye says, no, that's what it matters. It matters whether you used it or not. Sorry. Lo kasha, kan shechziku b'nei mavoy b'mavoy, kan shechziku b'nei mavoy b'mavoy. The whole point is, as our Mishnah is going to say later today, if I, let's say to all the people in this room, right, in this Zoom room, you can use my courtyard. But then I, 5 minutes later or 5 hours later, walk out into the courtyard, I'm changing my mind. I'm showing that I no longer want to let you do it. And therefore, it's mivatel, it cancels the permission I gave you. But if you already took advantage of that and carried out into the mavoy, it sort of cements. Again, this is all, as we said before, this is not a regular kinyan. Right? You don't need a kinyan. Sudar, as we said yesterday, right? You don't need to actually make a kinyan for this. It's all Eruv rules. It's specific to Eruv, and they permit it in this context, according to what we're saying now, that if the people in the mavoy were already machzik, they already used it, then you cannot cancel it just because the person who gave reshut seems to be taking it away. Tanya, and in fact, why? Let me see Hanan's question. I'm going to ask you to hold off, Hanan. We're going to get to that a little bit later today. But it depends. So the answer is that if it's not your reshut, you can't do it. If you're a guest, you might be able to, but it's going to be a little more complicated. Okay. So says the Gemara Vatanya, and Rashi says benichuta. This supports it. The Braita says very clearly, im ad shalom natan reshito hotzi. If before the person who gave you reshut carries, meaning before you used it. No, let's take it back. So Rashi says this is something totally different. Tosfos doesn't like that. Rashi says this is a new case, which is going to get us into today's daf, which is, let's say a person lives in a chatzer, right? And they have not carried from their house into the chatzer on Shabbat. Now, they're not allowed to. There's no Eruv, right? So again, let me just do the example. There are 5 people living in this chatzer. They forgot to make an Eruv, let's say, or 4 of them made an Eruv, and the 5th one didn't participate. If that 5th person, before they give everyone else permission to use their portion in the chatzer, carries into the chatzer on Shabbat, which is not permitted, right? So then says the Braita, whether it's b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, yachol levatel. Whether they did that b'shogeg or b'mezid, they can be mevatel their portion to everybody else. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Now Rashi understands, Tosfos really does not like this, that the question here has nothing to do with changing your mind. It has to do with whether a rasha or a mummer can be mevatel. Right? Remember, we said a goy cannot be mevatel. Says Rashi, if a person carries from their house into the public on Shabbos, that's their mechalel Shabbat. And since they're mechalel Shabbat, they're a mummer. And a mummer might be like a goy. Says Rabbi Meir, that's not the case. Even a mumar who does it on b'mezid is not going to be removed from the category of someone who can be mevatel, like a tzeduki, right? And we're going to discuss this. That's how Rashi understands it. Tosfos thinks it doesn't make any sense because that's not the context. And Tosfos also points out, just for the record, that just because a person wants to carry on Shabbat and does b'mezid doesn't make you a mummer, right? A mummer means you have a pattern, your pervasive use of avera, that you don't follow things. Just because once, even b'mezid, you decide, you're really hungry and there's a food in the courtyard and you want to bring it in, just doing something once b'mezid, or maybe even many times, doesn't make you into a mummer. So Tosfos is bothered by that terminology, but that's how Rashi understands it. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, it depends. If you took it out b'shogeg, you're carrying from your house to a chatzer that you're not allowed to carry. If you did it b'shogeg, you're not a mummer. And then you can be yachal levatel. You can then change your mind on Shabbat and say to the other people in the courtyard, I'm mevatel my chelik to you, and you can they can then all use the courtyard. But if you do it b'mezid, then ain't yachal levatel, right? And that's because, according to Rashi, because you're a mumar, and therefore a mumar is like a non-Jew and cannot be mevatel. If, continues the Braita, and this is the part we want to prove from, mi shenatan reshuto, if, let's say, the 5th guy gives you permission. So again, I just want to clarify the case. These are confusing cases, but there's 5 people in a chatzer, 4 of them made an eruv, the 5th one did not. So the 4 people can do nothing because they have 4/5 of it, but that's not 5/5. They go to this guy, number 5, and they say, can you please help us out? And he says, sure. I give up my portion in the chatzer to you, right? But then, 5 minutes later, he carries out, hotzi. Then he goes and carries out. So the question is, did he change his mind? So, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, oser. No matter what, whether he did it on purpose, because he knew he wasn't supposed to, but he went out, or he forgot, it's still osers, because he's clearly showing that he no longer wants to relinquish his right to the chatzer. Divrei Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yehuda says, b'mezid oser, the shogeg eno oser. It's only if he did it on purpose because he was thoughtfully doing it. But if he did it by mistake, it doesn't prohibit it because he just forgot. Bemed dvar memurim, says the Braita, b'shelo hichzik b'nei mavoy b'mavoy. That's only if the 4 people didn't bring their picnic out before the 5th one gave up, tried to retake his rights. If the people, and again, in this case, Rabbi Gamliel's children, walked out into the space and used it before the person who had given permission changed their mind or went outside, then bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, eno oser. And so the issue really is, according to this understanding, this is Rabbi Abaya, is that the reason that Rabbi Gamliel wanted his children to go out into the chatzer is not because if they didn't, it would become aser. It's because in case the person changed their mind, them going out will allow them to continue using it on Shabbat. Continues the Gemara, Amar
What does
Mar.
shogeg and mazid mean in this context? That they went out knowing it's Shabbos, or they went out knowing they didn't have a portion in the chutzner?
That's a good question. So I would say the first one, right? I mean, it's a question of showing amazing in terms of Avera. So not knowing whether what he did, well, not as a Shabbos, or whether it's prohibited. Right? The person in his, again, let's say it's me. I don't want it to be me, but let's say it was me, and I said, you have my portion in the chutzner. I am misalek. I take away all rights I have to the chutzner, in which case I cannot carry from my house into somebody else's chutzner. It's going from my rishut to someone else's rishut. So that's a prohibited thing on Shabbat. Now, it might be D'Rabbanan, and that's a whole other question of what's D'Rabbanan and D'Oraita. But then if I did it by mistake, meaning I didn't realize that it was prohibited, that's in the first part, that doesn't make me a Rasha, of course, right? In the second part, which is why Tosfos thinks it's different, you shouldn't have two different parts, it's a question of whether I was cognizant that I was, needed to have a portion in the Chatzar in order to carry on Shabbat. I sort of forgot. And if I've forgotten, then I'm not reasserting my rights to the Chatzar. I just didn't realize that you even have to have rights in order to go into this Chatzar.
But Ali, I would say that suggests that it's James's second suggestion, that it's whether or not one is intentionally undoing one's nullification, intentionally undoing the bittul. If you're intentionally undoing the bittul, because the implication of the Mishnah that we're going to see later today is that you're intentionally undoing the bittul, not that you're intentionally trying to violate Shabbos.
Correct. Sorry, so I agree with that. That's Tosfos' point, why he doesn't like Rashi's. So Rashi did both, basically. Rashi said that the first part of the Braita was referring to whether you're a mummer or not a mummer. And the second part, which is what was relevant for us, was what David just said much more elegantly, right? Is that it has to do with Bittul Shos. Hanan, again, to your question, I let me just be very clear. If I live in a house and there's a chatzar in front of my house and I don't have a portion of that chatzar, I cannot carry from my house into that chatzar. It's possible that if I'm already in the chatzar, right, and there's something there, I can carry within the chatzar if I'm a guest of someone who owns the chatzar. But I certainly, and we'll see this in the Mishnah, cannot carry from my house into the chatzar after I did bittul. But in this case, I did do that. So the question is, by doing that, am I being mevatel my bittul? Right, that's the question. Am I undoing my bittul? Continues the Gemara Amar Mar. So we're at the two dots. Rabbi Yehuda said, and this is going back to the right that we quoted yesterday, B'lashon acheret. Yehuda quoted this whole story of Rabbi Gamliel and his children in another way. That what Rabbi Gamliel said to his children was Maharu va'asu tzarchechem b'mavoi ad shelo techshech. You should go and do all the things you need to do in the mavoi before it gets dark, right? V'yasar alechem, and then it would become aser, implying that there's no way for you to use this mavoi on Shabbat. You better take care of all your business, right? Move out your dry cleaning before Shabbat, because there's no way to do it. Alma nachriyu. You see that Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that Rabbi Gamliel considered the tzeduki to be a non-Jew, and just like a non-Jew cannot be mevatel, a tzeduki cannot be mevatel. Doesn't matter, but that goes against our Mishnah. Hananzan achel yotzi. Our Mishnah said, right? Hanan achel yotzi tznan. Sorry, we learned until you have to be careful, take it out before the yotzi, before he goes out. So what do you mean the day? No. Ema achelo yotzei hayom. What it should mean, yotzei hayom, is you should carry out, according to Rabbi Yehuda, before the day goes out, meaning before Shabbat starts, do all your stuff, because once Shabbat starts, there's no way you can carry into the mavoi, because there's the tzeduki there. A tzeduki is like a non-Jew, and therefore you're stuck, okay? The baidema, or else it's maybe possible that there could be multiple levels of tzeduki, right? Elokasha kam b'mumar l'chalosh shabbatot b'tzina, kam b'mumar l'chalosh shabbatot b'farhesia. One is referring to, meaning our Mishnah, where we said Yotzi might be referring to a case where, in fact, you only have to worry about it if the tzeduki carries out, because the tzeduki can be mevatel. That is because maybe the tzeduki is a mumar, right, to be mechal Shabbat, but only in private. And that does not make him like a non-Jew. But Rabbi Yehuda's case was where he was a mumar, the chalal Shabbat b'farhesia, in public. That makes him like a non-Jew, and therefore he can't be mevatel. Tosfos, of course, points out the obvious, which is that tzedukim don't believe in the, well, let me say this. Tosfos points out two things. First of all, according to Rashi at least, this is not just mean doraita, it means even drabanan, even things like eruv, right? And things that are drabanan will make you a mummer. In which case, what do you mean a tzeduki is a mummer l'chala b'tzina? Well, a mummer doesn't believe in any of the midrabanans that we would say. And Tosfos points out, again, the obvious, that there are many people who live in societies where they conform to the society because they don't want to stick out, even though they don't believe in anything they're doing, right? So that's very possible that this is a tzeduki who does all the things and follows all the rules in public because they don't want to be labeled or they don't want to stick out or they want their kid to get a good shidduch or whatever, right? But it still doesn't mean that they are necessarily believe in it. But that's enough in this telling to allow them to be mevatel their rishut not like a Jew, like a Yisrael. But if they're b'farhesia, then they cannot be mevatel rishut. Says the Gemara Kiman Azla. So who is going, according to this following Braita, the Tanya, if a person is mumar, let's say a person is a mumar, which again, I'm going to translate here as someone who doesn't follow the Torah, or giloy panim, which we think means someone who's, just megale panim, usually means you're brazen, you're mechutzaf, I think is Rashi's words here. Is there Rashi says that? Yeah, chatzuf, right? I don't know how to translate chatzuf exactly. But those people, they are out of the category. They're like goyim. They cannot be mevatel rishut for an eruv. Doesn't work. 1 second. Giloy panim mumar had would mean just because someone is rude doesn't make them a mumar. Ella, what the Braita means is mumar big giloy panim. A person who is a mumar in public, or not necessarily in public, but in a way that sticks it in your face, then that person ina yachol levatel rishut. And Kiman Rabbi Yehuda, that's exactly what Rabbi Yehuda just said, which is that sometimes a tzeduki is unable to be mevatel rishut, and sometimes they can, and it depends on how public they are about being a tzeduki. But according to this telling, which is what Rashi said earlier, Rabbi Meir would hold that no matter what they did, as long as they're a Yisrael, even if they're a mumar, or even if they're a tzeduki, they can still be mevatel rishut. Now, there was a case, this is a really important halacha case, Ahu, the nafdak bechumarta de madusa. There was a person who went out with a Rashi does not say it means medusa, unfortunately, but he went out with a chamorta. Rashi is like some kind of stamp that had some other seal that wasn't appropriate. It wasn't good for jewelry. It wasn't good for sign, or it was good for signing, but it was a kli. So you carried on Shabbat that you're not allowed to carry. Here's another shot that maybe it was something that smelled nice. It was like deodorant. Either way, you're not allowed to carry this thing on Shabbat. This person, he would walk around with it every Shabbat. He loved it. It was his, necklace, even though it's prohibited. But given the Chazia, Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya Kassia, when he saw Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, who was the Rosh Hashiva, maybe, or the Nasi at least, he covered it up. Amar, so they said, or maybe Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya said, Kigon Zeh Mevatel Rishut Rabbi Yehuda. This is the kind of person who, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even though a Mumar L'Chalal Shabbat B'Farhesi cannot be Mevatel Rishut, this guy can. And of course, this becomes the source, or one of the sources, in a lot of halacha of how you define mumar b'farhesia. Because clearly, this was a person who was no problem doing this in public, right? He just didn't want to do it in front of Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, which is as high as you can get. And so, the question of if a person has, as they say, no shame, right? How do you define shame? So shame might be, if my mother was there, I wouldn't do it, but I don't care about anyone else. Or, so I think in the halacha, again, not posking from any of this, but clearly, public does not just mean public or private. It really means some level of busha that, at least in front of Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, he still had, and therefore, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, this person can be mevatel rishut. Amar Rav Huna continues the Gemara, says Rav Huna on sort of a related note, Ezuhu Yisrael Mumar. Who is a Yisrael Mumar, right? Who counts as a Yisrael Mumar? Zeh mechalal Shabbatot b'farhesia. That means someone is mechalal Shabbat in public. What do I do? Nothing. Okay. Amalei Rav Nach, do you hear me, everyone? We're good.
Yep.
All good.
Okay. So it says Rav Huna, what's a Yisrael Mumar? It's someone who's mechal Shabbat in public. Amalei Rav Nach, it says Rav Nach, 1 second. I don't understand that statement. Come on. Who are you going according to? There's another machloket, which we, I guess, had a few years ago in Bechorot, where there was an argument as to when someone is chashud on one Avera, are they chashud on all other things? Like, let's say someone cheats at their Bechor, which was the case there. Do you then assume that they're going to cheat in other things? So if it's Rav Meir who said, chashud l'davar achad, If a person is clearly, or is chashud, that they violate one commandment, they are therefore chashud l'kol Torah kula, right? Therefore, they're suspect on violating all of the Torah. You don't follow one rule, we have to assume you won't follow any of the rules. Then I don't get it. Why you need to be mechalel Shabbat to be a mumar? Afilu bechad mikol yisurim shebetorah nami. Any avera that you do or that you're mevatel, you should, if you do it in public, it should be a mumar, because if we suspect you're doing one thing wrong, we think you're going to do anything wrong. And if it's Rabbanan who say that's not the case, then chashud davar echad lo avi chashud l'chol Torah kula, right? That if you suspected or even known to do one thing wrong, you're not suspected for other things, just for that thing. So I don't understand why, if you're mechal Shabbat, you become a mumar. It should mean you're a mumar for Shabbat, but you're not a mumar for everything. Ad havi mumar lavodat kochavim, right? The only exception that the Gemara said in Bechorot is if you're a mumar for avodah zarah, right? So everyone agreed that if you are violate avodah zarah, then you're suspected on everything. You don't follow, if you worship idols, then we consider it to be that, it's as if you're not necessarily following any mitzvah. But why would Shabbat be in that category? So Amar of Nachman Bar Yitzchak, you misunderstood the whole statement of Rav Huna, right? All Rav Huna meant was not for general rules of who's a mumar for things like, testimony or yayin nesech or other things like that. It was talking about just Shabbos. The only question was litain reshut, levatel reshut. Who can give and be mevatel reshut to your chatzar, which we said again, a non-Jew cannot do that. A Jew can. What about a mumar? So our Mishnah is now saying, or Rav Huna is saying, that a mumar l'chalel Shabbat b'farhesya is not able to give reshut on Shabbat. Ukeditanya, and as the following Braita says, Yisrael mumar. Let's say you have a Jew who has left the path, right? Who is mishamer Shabbato b'shuk, but he at least observes Shabbat in public. So then that person can be mivatel reshut and can, where am I? B'shuk mivatel reshut. That person can cancel their reshut. So meaning, although they're Yisrael mumar, we know that they don't observe Shabbat, let's say in private, but nonetheless, the fact that they do it in public is enough, which is exactly what Rav Huna might have just said. If you're Eino Mishamer Shabbato B'shuk, they don't keep Shabbat in public, then Eino Mevatel Reshut, then they cannot be Mevatel Reshut on Shabbat. Then they Amru, as we said, that Yisrael can be Notel Reshut, or the Girsa really should be Mevatel, right, which is consistent with what we said. Can be Mevatel Reshut, Vin Notain Reshut. They can be mevatel and give it, take and give. But nachri, ad yaskir, until you rent it, and a Yisrael mumar counts like a nachri in this saying. Ketzad, amar lo reshuti kinuya lecha, reshuti mevutal lecha, kaneh be'ein tzarich l'skot. What does that mean? This is going back to the ratio, Rashi says. What does it mean? That the way I can be mevatel reshut is all I got to say is my reshut is kanui to you, or your reshut is mevutal, right? And your konet, you don't need to make a kinyan, you don't need to have a transaction. This is a kula that we made about Erev, that you can give over your reshut in this method without any sort of formal legal mechanism beyond this.
I will note, I think this is the first time that we're seeing this, because I don't think we had that yesterday.
I take it back. I confused yesterday and today. I already learned that, so I take it back. Yeah. And Rashi's Kinyan Sutter here, so that was what I was referring to. Correct. So thank you, David. Continues the Gemara. Rav Ashi says, I totally disagree. I don't disagree. I have another explanation of Rav Huna. When Rav Huna said that a mumar is the chalel Shabbat b'far hesa, he wasn't referring only to Eruv and being mevatel reshut. Rav Ashi says, Haitana, who he's going according to a whole nother Tana. Right? Remember, the question of Rav Huna was that the machloket Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim was either if you're a mumar for one avera or you're a mumar for everything, in which case it shouldn't be Shabbos, it should be any mitzvah. Or the Chachamim who said you're a mumar for one thing, you're only a mumar for that thing and nothing else, unless you're a mumar for avodah zarah. Says Rav Ashi, there's a third Tana. Hai Tana who dechamir le Shabbat kavodah zarah. There's another Tana who says that Shabbat is just as strict as avodah zarah, so that if you are a mumar for Shabbat, it also counts as if you're a mumar for avodah zarah. And what's this Tana? Tana. Remember, the pasuk says, the second pasuk in Vayikra, it says, Daber al b'nei Yisrael. Adam ki akriv mikem karban lashem. Person who brings the word mikem seems very strange, right? From you. It says the Braita, mikem, from you, bringing a karban. V'lo kulchem, not everyone from Bnei Yisrael can bring a karban. Prat the mumar, except a mumar cannot bring a karban, at least not a karban ola, right? Continues the Braita, mikem, we darshan the word mikem to say, bachem chalakti v'lo be'umot. Among you, Yisrael, I split up, says God, who can bring a karban. If you do mitzvot, you can. If you're a mummer, you can't. But among the nations, there's no question. Everyone, even a non-Jew, can bring a karban, even if they're quote unquote a mummer, right? They're obviously not following mitzvot, but they are allowed to bring. It's not an exclusion among the umot. Continues the Braita. It says min ha-behema. What do we learn from the extra min ha-behema? Lahavi, that also people b'nei adama domim lebehema, even people who act like animals, meaning they do averot, or don't listen to God, and that's Rashi's terminology, that they act as if there's no rules. They just do whatever they want to do. Even those people can bring a karban, which seems to contradict what we just said, right? Lahavi b'nei adam hadomim lebehema. Mikan amru, says the Braita, this is also a beautiful Braita, mikablin karbanot miposhe Yisrael. We accept karbanot from sinners. Again, these are not people who did tshuva. People who are standing in their sin. They're poshe Yisrael. Why? Kadesh yachzaru b'tshuva. We want them to return. And as Rashi says, again, very beautifully here, find it. I'm reading Rashi. If you push them away with your hands, to lo hadri, they're never going to come back. So even though they are sinners, they're not even doing tshuva. They're bringing a karban ola, right, which is a voluntary karban. We don't want to push them away because we're afraid they'll never do tshuva. So we embrace them even though they're sinners, says the Braita. Chutz, but there's exceptions. There's limits to us too. Chutz min ha-mumar, except for a person who, and we think mumar means that he rejects all of the Torah, or minasech yayin, which is avodah zarah, right? And mechalel shabbatot b'farhesya, and someone who mechalel shabbat. So that's the Braita. Now says the Gemara, the Braita makes no sense internally. Hagufa kasha. First you said mikem lo kulchem means hotziat mumar. You excluded a mumar from bringing a karban. Then you said, no, hadar tani mikablin karbanot poshe Yisrael. We accept karbanot from sinners. How do you explain that? So says the Gemara, well, hello kasha, it must be that Reisha has been mumar l'chol Torah kula. The first case of the Braita was if you reject the entire Torah, in which case you cannot bring a karban. Mitziata, the middle case, is mumar l'davar echad. You violate one avera, or a few, but not all of them, right? And then we do accept your karban because we want you to stay close and we want you not to be further rejected and we want you to eventually come back, says the Braita. But then look at the third case, Ema Sefer. Then we finally said, except, who are the exceptions? Chutz min ha-mumar u'min ha-seich yayin. Now I don't get it. Hai mumar hechitami. What, the word mumar now, the second mumar, who is that? Im mumar halachol Torah kula. That's the same thing you said in the Reisha. Why are you repeating it? Hainu Reisha. Either davar echad, if it's a mumar for one avera, then you just said, if someone doesn't have avera, we do accept a karban. Kasha mitziata. Elalav hachikamer. Says Rav Ashi, this is what the Braita is saying. And this is what Rav Huna is relying on. It's saying, chutz min ha-mumar linasech yayin l'chalal shabbat b'farhesya. Right? So it says the first part of the Braita, a person who does no avera, no mitzvot, is not allowed to bring a karban. The person who does averot is poshe Yisrael, is allowed to bring a karban, unless they are mumar for the two cardinal sins in this case. Right? The two cardinal sins being avodah zarah, which everyone agrees to, but according to this Tana, mechalel shabbat b'farhesya is also a cardinal sin, and therefore, or at least, again, not in the terminology we usually use, but in this case, and therefore that's what Rav Huna relied on, or Rav Huna said that avodah zarah and that Shabbat is like avodah zarah. Alma avodah zarah v'Shabbat ki adadinenu shema mina, according to this Tana. And so that's what Rav Huna was referring to.
Wouldn't it show that you don't reject the entire Torah if you're bringing a korban?
That's a good point. I mean, I maybe you want to do it to be part of the crowd. I don't know exactly. Maybe you made a donation. Everyone was giving at the PTA meeting. I'm not sure. But I guess you don't have to believe a karban just to bring it. But it's a good point. Continues the Mishnah. Now this is what we've quoted this Mishnah several times already, but we finally get to read it. Anshe chatzar. We finally get to the concept of bittul, which again we've been discussing all week, right? And more. You have a bunch of people live in a chatzar. Again, I'm going to use 5 people. Rashi often uses 5 people. Sheshachach echad, well, sometimes. Sheshachach echad me'hem v'lo yirev. This person, again, 5 people live in a courtyard. one of them forgot to give his portion or her portion to the Eruv. So the other four gathered together, they made an Eruv, they put it in one person's house. This fifth person did not contribute. And by mistake. Says the Mishnah, lo yurev. Beito asur milachnis ulahotzi lo vilahem. His house is prohibited for them and for him to go into and to leave from. So you can walk in, but you can't carry. You can't carry from his house into the Chatzer. He can't carry out, and people in the Chatzer cannot carry, into his house. This does imply that they can carry in the Chatzer, which we're going to see is very problematic. Because how can they carry in the Chatzer if he's the fifth guy who owns a portion and he didn't make an Eruv with them? But we'll discuss that in the Gemara. Vishalahen, but their houses, mutarin lo vilahem, he can carry from their houses into the Chatzer, and so can they. And again, we're going to discuss this in the Gemara. Natnu lo rishutan, if they give him permission, right? So they say, oh boy, we forgot to make an Eruv, but none of us really need to carry this Shabbat. We are mevatel our entire portion to you. So now basically one person owns the whole Chatzer, the guy who forgot to make an Eruv. So then humotar, he can carry, but hey nasurin, they cannot carry from their houses into the Chatzer because they're going from their own rishos into his rishos, and therefore it's prohibited. We'll ask again why they can't be his guest. Hayu shnayim. Now let's say two people in the Chatzer forgot to make an Eruv. So then osrin zelzeh, they prohibit each other. She'echad notein reshut v'notar reshut, because the rule is that if you have one person who forgot to make an Eruv, that person can either give his portion to other people, notein reshut, or notel reshut, or be recipient of all of the ownership or possession of the Chatzer. But shnayim, if you have two people who forgot to do an Eruv, they can be notein reshut, they can give up, right? Meaning if I and someone else forgot to make an Eruv, we can say we're mevatel our portion to everybody else, and then they can carry. But you cannot accept it. Ain't notein reshut. Okay? And again, we're going to discuss in 5 minutes what all these cases were, because none of them are clear to me. Maybe they're clear to you. Continues the Mishnah, though, just one last point, or two last points. Now, when can you do this, right? When can this person, let's say again, there's 5 people in the Chatzer, 4 make an Eruv, 1 doesn't. When can that person say to everyone else, I'm mevatel my portion to you? Says Beit Shammai, only before Shabbat. Omer mi bodyo. It has to be done before Shabbat starts, right? Your question is, why don't you just join the Eruv? I don't know. Maybe you're in shul, right? You're all at shul Friday night. You realize this guy forgot to give in, or he doesn't have enough food, or whatever the reason is. But he has to be during the day, says Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel says, you could even do it after dark, meaning even on Shabbat itself. Misha natan reshuto v'hotzi. Now let's say a person, this is the case we quoted earlier today, a person gave reshut to everyone else to use their portion in the Chatzer, but then they carried into the Chatzer. So then says the Mishnah, whether you did it b'shogeg or mezid, you then basically rescinded your reshut, and therefore everyone else is prohibited from going into the Chatzer, and as are you. Therefore, every mayor, and Rabbi Yehuda says, b'mezid oser, but b'shogeg eno oser, only if you did it on purpose, because you knew that you were, even knowing that you weren't supposed to, but b'shogeg you would not be asur. Okay, and again, we'll discuss that more, not today, tomorrow, or in 2 days. Says the Gemara, Beito hu da'asur. I don't get the first part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, again, I am one individual living in a Chatzer. I forgot to make an Eruv. Everyone in the Chatzer I was mevatel my reshut to everyone else. Well, it doesn't say what it is. I forgot. My house is also for me to leave with food or carrying, and for everyone to come into, implying Beito hu da'asur hachatzero sharia. They can carry into his Chatzer. How can they carry into his Chatzer? Echidami. Either batil. If this person who forgot to make an Eruv said, I give up all my rights, so then it means he no longer has any rights. So then Beito amay asur. Why, if I give up all my rights, can't people walk into my house? It's no longer my house, right? It's part of the shared space of the Chatzer. Either lo batil, if I didn't give up my rights, then no one can walk into the Chatzer either. Because then I have a portion in the Chatzer that I didn't make an Eruv for. Chatzero amay shari. Why would the Chatzer be permitted? You have to understand the case of a Mishnah. I went out on Shabbat, again, I'm assuming I'm the one who forgot to make an Eruv, and I said, okay, I give up all rights I have this Shabbat in the Chatzer. but not in my house, because I don't want people coming into my house, right? So my house remains private and therefore off limits. The chatzer becomes the property, so to speak, of the other people in the chatzer, right? My portion of the chatzer becomes theirs, and therefore they can carry in their houses and in the chatzer, but no one can carry in my house. Because Savri Rabbanan, now this was a machloket, if you recall, we had around 5 weeks ago, as to whether you can even do such a thing. And in fact, the Rabbanan hold that your mevatel reshut chatzero, reshut betel lo betel, that you can give up your rights in the courtyard without giving up your rights in the house. Because there's such a thing as living in a house without a courtyard. If you recall earlier, Rabbi Eliezer had an opinion that there's no such thing, that you can't live in a house. It's inhumane to live in a house without a courtyard. And therefore, if I said I'm giving up my courtyard, I'm also giving up my house. But it says the Chachamim, that's not the case. And that's what our Mishnah is referring to. It says the Mishnah further, Shelahen, the other people's houses and the Chatzer, mutar lo v'lahen. Now why? How could I walk into your house and carry from your house into the Chatzer if I didn't make an Eruv with you? Which was Hanan's question, I think, a little bit earlier, right? So again, the case is I didn't make any Eruv. I said to you, I'm sorry I didn't make an Eruv. I don't want everyone to be punished because of me. I give up my right in the Chatzer. Says the Mishnah, I can walk into your house and pick up your cholent and carry it out to the courtyard to eat lunch. How could that be? Because that's what happens when you're mevatel. Mevatel involves two parts. One part, which is the required part, is I take away a misalik. I remove my portion. But there could be a second part to it. And the second part might be, not always, but sometimes I become your guest. And if I'm your guest, if I walk into your house on Shabbat, I get to do whatever you can do. And since you can carry, because you have an Eruv, I'm allowed to, as your guest, carry from your house into the Chatzer. But you can't carry to my house because I'm not a guest in my house, right? I'm the Balabait. So therefore, my time at the Havi Oreach Legabayo, he becomes like a guest in their space, in their houses and their courtyard. However, Natnu Lo Reshutan, if let's say they give him it, right? So again, one guy didn't make the Eruv, but all the other people get together and say, you know what? We don't need to use the Chatzer. We give up all our rights in the Chatzer to you. So now I can carry from my house into the Chatzer. I'm the only owner. But they cannot carry. Why can't they carry? Right? Why can't they be my guest? Right? Says the Gemara, why don't you say they're all my guests? So I now own the Chatzer. I own my house. They can carry from my house into the Chatzer. Why is that a problem? Says the Gemara, because it doesn't make any sense. Chad legabe chamisha havi oreach. Right? If you have one among 5 people, I'm a guest. I'm one of many. I'm one in the house. But chamisha legabe chad lo havi orchim. You never have one person who invites 5 guests to come over and overwhelm their house. It doesn't make any sense to view it as a guest relationship. They're much more numerous. And since they're more numerous, we only view it as when they were nivatel, that they said, we are taking away our portion, but they're not assuming, or maybe they can't assume, that they become guests, and therefore they cannot get the rights of a guest. And so, and period. Now, says Gemara, we understand that the Mishnah's case is where, again, I forgot to make an Eruv. I went and said, I'm mevatel my reshut. And then we think it's one case. Then the 5 people, or the 4 people said, we're mevatel our reshut to you. So Shmamina, you can see conclusively from this Mishnah that mevatlin mechozin mevatlin. And this was a question that was yesterday, I think, or at least 2 days ago. Well, okay, both maybe, right? Whether you can be mevatlin, it was a whole machloket of Abaya, right? Well, of Rav Yosef, sorry, mevatlin mechozin mevatlin. Right? Shmuel, right? Whether you sorry?
I think it was Rav and Shmuel.
Okay. Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, maybe.
Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, you're right.
Okay. But you can be mevatlin or chozin mevatlin. You see clearly from our Mishnah, what's the whole question? They want to know. As I read the Mishnah, that it's 2 cases. The first case is that the one who forgot to make the Eruv is mevatel his part. The second case is if all the other people are not nulo rishutan me'ikara, meaning as initial thing, then humutar v'heina subir. Okay, let's just read a few more lines of the Mishnah. I hope this is clear. Hayushnayim oshim zeh. If there are 2 people who forgot to make an Eruv, then they are aser one on the other. Says where of course they aser one on the other. There's 2 people, they didn't make an Eruv. Pshita. Lo tzricha, no. The hadar chad minah batlei l'chavre. Even if one of them, sorry, I just want to clarify the case, right? There's 2 people, there's a courtyard of 5 people. 3 of them made an Eruv, 2 of them forgot to make an Eruv, okay? then the three people go to the two and they say, okay, we can't use the chutzner anyways because our eruv doesn't work. So we're mevatel our portion to you, to the two of you. So then our Mishnah said they can't use it because they aser each other, and that's pshita. Says the Gemara, kamash malan, even lo tzricha the hadar chad minay batalei lechavre. Even if one of them, one of the two, then said, well, this is useless, right? What's the point of the two of us being aser? I'm mevatel my portion to you. So you might have thought, ma detema lishteri, that would then be permitted. Again, the three said we give up everything to you two. One of the two says, I give up everything to you one. So why don't we say that he becomes the sole owner and therefore he's allowed to use the chatzer on Shabbat because there's no competing owners? Kamash malan, this is a good legal concept, that kivan de idna debato, at the time that the three people who made the Eruv said, we're mivatel to you two, lo havi leisher yute b'hai chatzer. There was no way for them to use it because they're two people who did not make an Eruv with each other. And so the fact that they own everything doesn't give them any help. And therefore, therefore it doesn't effectuate or become effective, and therefore the bittul doesn't happen. That's how Rashi understands it. And so even though later I went and I said one to the other that I want to be vato my place to you, the bittul from the three was not yet, doesn't become effective because pretty much the whole concept of bittul is I'm mevatel to you so that you can use it on Shabbat. But if the time I'm mevatel to you, you can't use it on Shabbat, then my bittul doesn't really count. Continues the Gemara, we'll just read that one more a few more words of the same thing. The Mishnah continued and said, because one person can give permission and be mevatel, two lamli, again, that's just repeating everything we said in the Mishnah. In notain, if it's that you can give it, Tanina, we learned that in the first part. In notel, Tanina seifa. Tanina, sorry, we learned that also. Seifa tzrichla, you're right. The words that one person can give reshut are not needed, but the words shnayim notin reshut is what's needed. That two people who forgot to make an eruv can be mevatel their portion in a chatzer. That's a chiddush. So why is that a chiddush? Hanami pshita. That too. Why wouldn't they be allowed to? No, because ma detema ligzar doma ati levituli luhu kamash malan. We just said that if two people forget to make an eruv, and everyone else in the chatzer is mevatel to those two people, it doesn't work, right? So you cannot be mevatel to them. And since you can't be mevatel to them, you might think we should make a gzera that they also cannot be mevatel. So you don't think that 1 week they were mevatel, the next week you can be mevatel to them. Kamashwan, you don't make such a gzera that we can differentiate. And so two people who forgot to make an eruv, you cannot be mevatel to them, but they can be mevatel their portion, and that would allow everybody else to carry in the chatzer and in their houses because they have an eruv and the whole thing was patel to them.
And they had to mevatel at the same time so that then mevatel could effectuate the usage?
Well, let me read the next line and then you can ask that. Ein notlin reshut lamali. Again, why is this? This is also extra. Lo tzricha afagav de amrle. Even if the three people said to the two, kni amanat lahaknot, which is not quite your question, but similar, right? Let's say they said, I'm giving it to the two of you on condition that one of you then gives it to the other one. I know it's useless to the two of you, but I don't know which one of you wants it. We have no, right, obviously we can't use our chutzner, even though we made an eruv. So what's the point in us keeping it? So we're mevatel our reshut to you two, even on condition that one of you go to the other. Says the Gemara, that also does not work. It's not enough. So that answers one part of your question. But your other questions, your real question was, can you do it at the same time? Is that the question?
Well, it seems like you can't mevatel if the mevatel isn't immediately effective. And it doesn't seem that three people could use it unless the two others both were mevatel at the same time. Otherwise, each of their single mevateling wouldn't be effective at that point.
Oh, so that's a very good question. You're saying if two people didn't make an eruv, how could they be mevatel?
Yes, because the mevatel can't be
so
effectuated.
That's a very, very good question. So let me say it this way. I think maybe I misstated it. What Rashi's point is, I think, is not that they have to be able to use it at that moment. It has to be that what you're giving up gives up your portion for Shabbat. So if I have portion in a chatzer and give up, I'm basically giving up my rights to these three people. They have full ability for Shabbat to use my rights. When the three people give it to two, for example, right, their rights don't really go to those two people because those two people aser on each other. They're both owners. So it's not, it's a legal, that's why I said it was a legal thing, so beyond my concept, but it's that at the time that you make this thing happen, it doesn't really have the effect that it's supposed to have on Shabbat of giving your reshut to someone else to have some ownership or responsibility over. But it's not that they necessarily can use it right away at that time. That's the more complicated answer. The simpler answer, which I don't think is correct, would be that maybe they have to do it together. I don't, Rashi doesn't say that, but it could be other people would say that. I didn't see that.
The case that we haven't discussed is whether the two people, if they who did not participate, if one of them gives it to the other before the three give it to the other three then give it to that fifth person, will that be effective?
Right. We didn't discuss that. I don't recall that we're going to get there so soon, but let's learn the Gemara and see. We're going to have tomorrow's daf many more of these cases, and also get into the very specific question of when you're mevatel, how exactly do you have to say it if there are many people involved? So hopefully it'll clarify, and if I see anything, I'll get back to you. 7:30, God willing, tomorrow morning, right? Excellent. And I know James wants earlier Motzei Shabbat, but let's email during the week because I'm not sure if I'm going to be here next Shabbat, so it might not be me making that answer. Okay.
If it's me, I always need as much time after Shabbos as possible because the minyan in my backyard starts like at the moment Shabbos ends or after that, so that's why. But we can, try and find some kind of compromise. But let me know, Ellie, if you
I'll
need
let
me
you
to do
know
it.
once I know. Thank you. Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. We'll see you tomorrow morning, hopefully.
Shavua Tov, thank you very much.
Shavua Tov, thank you.